Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today I am talking all about this ego story. I guess it's not really a story, it's more of a state of denial. It's a non story. So the ego often preserves its sense of self by just denying that parts of itself exist. These are usually the parts that we don't want to look at, the ones that evoke shame, guilt, resentment, the things that about ourselves that we don't really like. What we will do when those things come up for us is we will sort of just deny them. And so it leads to this weird thing where we sort of lie to ourselves and we lie to other people. So in this episode, I talk a lot. I have a big intro that talks basically about where this story comes from and how it serves us. And then I talk about what things that you do will point you in the direction that you could be in a state of denial. After that, I talk about some things that you can do to come to peace with what you've been denying in yourself. And lastly, I leave you with a few tips and ideas about how to deal with someone who is in a state of denial themselves. Okay, you guys, I hope you enjoy this episode. Without further ado, welcome to the Get Out of Your Head podcast, where we talk all about the stories that keep you stuck, blocked from manifesting what you really want, and away from your authentic life. I am your host, Sarah, from Spirit, Mind, Body. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope this episode finds you happy and healthy and well. Full disclosure, I have been battling a cold for the past 2 or so weeks. It seems like it's just never going to go away. And so if my voice is a little froggy or hoarse, sorry. But this is where we're at, and I guess we just kind of got to push through it at some point because otherwise it probably will never get done. So today I am talking about this ego story, and it's not really like a story. It's not a story per se, as in like a phrase or something that we tell ourselves. It's sort of an anti-story, which is the fact that the ego does this thing, and it kind of sits in the state of denial. And this is one of the trickier stories that I think that I've ever addressed with the ego, because how do you know what you don't know, right? If you're in a state of denial, you don't know you're in a state of denial. But I sort of guess this is the same with all of the stories, because when you're telling yourself a story, you don't see it as a story, you see it as fact or reality. And so there's always something to point you to your veil that you're seeing through or your illusion. And so that's what I hope to do for you in this episode. I hope to give you some things to point yourself to so that you can say, if I'm doing this, that I can recognize, then maybe I'm still in my state of denial. So this episode is also really content dense. I wasn't sure how to not make it content dense, meaning there's a lot of big topics. If you're new to some of these spiritual things, these concepts and ideas, just hang with me. I will try to explain everything as best as I can, and probably each topic could make its own episode, and I probably will do that, but we have to start somewhere. So here we are. I hope it's not too much. Okay, so let's just get into it. So fundamentally, the ego is the defender of the shadow, and I have talked about the shadow work before, and if you are with me on this podcast journey, I have it set in my calendar for a shadow episode to come out on January 18th. That's tentative. That can totally fluctuate. So I just look for that if that's something that interests you. But ultimately, just to give you the down and dirty, the shadow contains these unintegrated parts of ourselves. So most of the time when we talk about the shadow, we're talking about negative attributes or pieces of ourselves that we don't really like. These pieces of ourselves are really hard to come to terms with. basically our most negative attributes that we don't really want to fess up to because it's really painful to go there. And so what we do is we are really good at recognizing or seeing things in others, but we have a really hard time seeing things in ourselves. I'm sure that you can think of something in your life where you have done the same thing, or you've seen somebody else do the same thing to somebody else, where they can point out the flaws in everybody else except themselves. That's a shadow aspect, right? Oftentimes these shadow aspects or the things that live in the shadow are associated with a deep sense of guilt, shame, anger, resentment, right? These really low vibe states of emotion, because they're so painful, they evoke these emotions we don't like to admit, or we don't like to look at these things in ourselves. But also on that, the shadow can also contain really positive attributes like untapped gifts and potential within you. So here's a side note. The most profound example I've ever seen of the shadow coming to light is in Byron Katie's work during her turnaround. So she asks 4 questions and then she does a turnaround, and it's very deep work that you just ask. It's very, she calls it inquiry. So you just ask yourself questions about what you think is true, and then come to terms with how it affects you and the person that you are and the person that you want to be. And then you do a turnaround, and the turnaround is all about how can I rephrase this in the opposite way. So for instance, if I'm saying they should do this, then the turnaround would be I should do this, or they shouldn't do this. Do you get what I mean? So it's a way of seeing it the opposite. When people come to terms with it, it's like, it's profound. It's very insightful. So I would, if you are new to Byron Katie, if you never have heard of her work before, you could start by looking at her book, Loving What Is. I liked the audio version best. I think she's also on YouTube. She has a lot of different books. She takes people through this. She even has her own website. So you could look at that if that's something that you're interested in. I just wanted to tell you that's a good example. If you are really confused about what the shadow is, that's a really good example of the shadow coming to light. So either way though, it will benefit you to find out what's in your shadow, because it is a part of you. The shadow holds your limiting beliefs. Your shadow holds where you're holding yourself back. It has your wounds and how to heal. And of course, your shadow has your highest path if you're not already walking it. And so it benefits you to find out what's in your shadow, because that's kind of the key. That's where you're blocking yourself from manifesting what you really want. That's where the plans for your highest self is. That's your ticket to your most ideal life. So your ego likes you to live in a state of a denial, and it is sort of like this defender of the shadow. So this is beneficial, right? Because when your ego is in denial, then that means that you as an ego, like the person that you think yourself to be, you don't have to take responsibility. You don't have to put in the work to make a change. You don't have to face difficult emotions, and you can actually go on thinking that you get to be the center of the universe if you don't have to face those things, right? So to put it another way, if my wounds, downfalls, or sources of shame are open for all the world to see, my ego takes the risk that someone could hurt me via that judgment, further shame, or criticism, right? And so if I cover all that up by shoving it in the shadow, then I never have to face it, and I can avoid, or my ego convinces me that I can avoid all that pain. So I just have to stop here quick, and I have to talk about shame. Shame is probably one of the most difficult emotions to get in touch with, and shame is what I would say is the driver of why we push things so deep into the shadow. For the longest time, I was so disconnected from my shame because I never felt it. I would push everything that was shameful away, and I would deny it. And, this is why I can talk to you guys about these kinds of things, is because I've been there. I've lived through it firsthand, of course. But for the longest time, like I said, I did not even understand what shame was. When somebody said shame, like there's these conversations going on about shame, I just didn't understand what that means. So I wanted to paint you guys a picture of shame, what it looks like, what it feels like, so that you can see what it's like if you're in this boat as well, right? Okay. So shame feels like you're in a room with everyone you know around you and you're being pointed at and laughed at because of something about you or something that you did. The only difference is that you don't see it as something that you did. You see it as an integral part of you that cannot be changed. And so it puts you into this, it's not even a story, it's just a feeling of being defective and broken, and that you are the only one with this problem. When you're the only one, you don't have a shoulder to cry on, you don't have a friend, you cannot reach out for a helping hand because there are none there. And that is what shame feels like. Shame feels incredibly isolating, and it feels like you are the only one. Like you are fundamentally the problem. So here's the thing about shame. Everyone has it. Everyone has a thing or several things that they feel immense shame about. So when you go into that room and everybody's laughing at you and pointing at you, what is that about? That's your shame trigger. And I don't advocate for like putting yourself in a shame state. I don't think that that's like necessarily healthy intentionally, but there is healing there. When you can go there and fully feel your shame, and when you can feel that completely, then you can bring it out of the shadows and then you can heal it. And another thing about shame is that when you feel shame about something, you tend to, I'm saying you, everybody does this. When someone feels shame about something, what they'll tend to do is they'll tend to project it onto somebody else. Meaning, if I feel shame about my body image, I'm going to criticize other people about their body image. And so shame inflicts hurt, and it inflicts further shame. It kind of perpetuates. And so the best way to deal with it is to heal it. Okay, that was actually really deep. To bring it back on topic, I had to talk about it though, so that we can understand why things go into the shadows. But being open about things that you don't like makes you super vulnerable, and that can be really scary, right? Especially if you were raised with a story that vulnerability equals weakness, and vulnerability and weakness are a source of shame for you, right? That really shoves everything down in the shadows. That makes it really hard to access. And so that's why I think that the work, or, shadow work, that when I always talk about the work, I mean like the deep work that you do to heal yourself, that is like the most courageous thing anybody can do. So here's the thing. If you have this story, if you can see this story in you, you have to understand that this process of denial serves a purpose, really. It's to protect you. It's to keep you safe and invulnerable and pain-free. That's what your ego is trying to do by denying the things that are uncomfortable to deal with, right? So if you know someone who lives in a state of denial, especially around topics that are really like near and dear to our hearts, the best thing that we can do is accept it. And it's so difficult because we sort of want somebody to come to terms with what they've been denying because we know it's better for them. We know that it'll set them free and all of these things. But can you see how if that person were to face what they've been denying, they've told themselves a story of that it would be the death of them, that it would be so painful for them to confront what they've been denying that it's just safer for them to pretend that it doesn't exist. And maybe you can even see some of this in yourself, and understanding that this comes from a place of pain, not weakness, makes this easier to confront. Okay, so how to deal with denial in yourself. Again, like I said, the tricky part is that on the surface, you don't really know you're denying it. You don't really, if somebody's in a state of denial, they wouldn't admit, yeah, I'm in a state of denial. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a state of denial. Do you get what I mean? But I think that deep down, if we ask ourselves, our highest selves, can I be honest about this? What am I needing to confront? What have I been denying? Your highest self always has the answers that you didn't feel like your conscious self or your ego could face. And we do need to realize that this comes from a place of pain, not weakness, because if you tell yourself that it comes from a place of weakness, weakness is a big shame story for a lot of us, right? And so if I tell myself that whatever I've been denying is actually like, if I confront that and that's weakness, there's no hope for me to try to fix it. And so we have to understand and meet ourselves with radical acceptance, and a lot of self-compassion and a lot of self-love in order to be able to look at these parts of ourselves and integrate it. And I would have to say that every time I have had to face something that I have told myself it's going to be so painful to deal with, it is never quite as bad as I've made it seem leading up to it. It's always the story of it's going to be painful that is way worse than the actual pain itself, right? When I sit down with myself and I face myself and I allow all feelings to be felt and I allow all the pain to be there and I just sit with it, it's never that bad. I just feel it. And then it moves through me and it's better. And really it leads to a place of healing and connectedness, because now I can connect with people who have also felt that before. And when I heal, of course, then I stop perpetuating my pain and my shame story. And so it really is quite courageous to sit down with your pain, with your shame triggers, and work through them one by one. If you never face your shame triggers, if you never face the pieces of your shadow, what tends to happen is that they'll start to run your life from your background. You'll avoid things that you really want to do, but that take courage, right? You will keep yourself guarded in relationships, and then there can never be true intimacy in that. And over time, these things just start to stack up. You start to trade in your long-term visions of your future, what you really want to do, for momentary, immediate gratification. And all of those things prevent you from being the person that you came here to be, from being the full expression of yourself. And I think this is what Mark Twain called the half-lived life. And this is why healing is so important. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things that point to a state of denial. So some things that you can kind of, when I'm doing this, am I denying something like that? Not always is this the case. When you do these things, it's not always indicative of a state of denial. And of course, this list is not all encompassing, but it's a good place to start. So the first thing is pretty obvious, but the first thing is, if you feel like you're lying, or if you know you're lying, then are you, then that's an invitation to ask, am I in an ego story that says that I have to deny this? And it's really this feeling where you're trying to make facts fit a narrative, or you're trying to change facts or events after the fact in order to match your story. And it's the most obvious if you're putting in so much effort to make your story fit. And I think that, I've even come to this point in my life in several different situations. But when I'm sitting here and I'm trying to, make something fit, and all of a sudden I'll just have this insight, like, just be honest about it. This is exhausting when you find yourself like wrapped up in a lie or in a story and you feel exhausted by it. That's a really good indication, like, where am I trying to make something fit so that it can fit my own agenda, instead of just allowing things to be apparent as they are. Does that make sense? And yeah, I think that if you come to that place where you're like, is this worth my energy? Maybe you need to ask yourself this age-old question that I think is so good. Do you want to be right, or do you want peace? And at the end of the day, if we're honest with ourselves, being right never is as satisfying as we think it's going to be. Yeah, you won the argument, and it's so short-lived. But peace, that's what we all are looking for, right? So that's the first point. Do you feel like you're lying? Just ask yourself that. Do I feel like I'm denying something? Do I feel like I'm not allowing the truth to come through, or that I'm covering something up? And is this a lot of effort to maintain this facade? Okay, the second one is projections with judgment. So I really could just say judgment, but I felt like I needed to talk about projections here. And I wanted to explain kind of what projections are all about. And this is another thing, like I said at the beginning of the episode, I could really do a whole podcast on all of these topics because they're so deep and there's so many things to talk about. But if you're kind of new to this stuff, I think that sometimes like it can get a little jargony. And so I just wanted to break it down really quick. But projections are really just how we perceive or how we see people, events, or situations through our own lens. And we're constantly figuring out how things apply to us. So some people say like projections are where you see other people's aspects of yourself. And I think, like I said, it's a little jargony. So if you just boil it down to like the nuts and bolts of it, projections are really where you see people, events, situations. We think we like to see those things objectively, but we really just see it through our own lens. And our own lens is shaped by all of our own experiences, our childhood, our upbringing, what we know, our education, that if we're male, female, the society we live in, where we grew up, all of those things shape our projections or the lens that we view the world. And so we're constantly trying to figure out, what would I do? How does that affect me? If that's true, what does that mean for me? And so all of that is fine when you're looking at a situation and you're trying to figure out, is this good, bad? Do I like it? Do I not like it? All those things. That's what I mean by a projection. So if it takes on a form of judgment or a moral, righteous tone, meaning that you start labeling something as absolute right, absolute wrong, or you position yourself on the side of right and condemn others that are on the side that you've labeled as wrong, then that's what I mean by like a judgment with, or a projection with judgment. Essentially, the subconscious question that you're, answering is, what should they do differently? How should this situation be different in order to fit into my set of belief systems? And, like I said, when it takes on a moral tone, I think it's funny because like we sort of feel like we're being virtuous, but really what we're doing is revealing a shadow aspect of ourselves. So just to break it down and bring it down to earth, I have an example, and it's this idea. Okay, so your belief system may be that parents should love their children unconditionally. I think a lot of us have that belief system. A lot of that is embedded in us. But then when you have that belief system, what happens is you start to, if you judge your parents for not loving you unconditionally, say I look at my parents and I'm like, you know what, they made me do soccer. They always tried to fit me into their mold. They never were there for me emotionally. They punished me for being who I was in certain circumstances, and I hold that against them. Then here's the thing, is that I am not loving them unconditionally. And as long as I keep up that idea, parents should love their kids unconditionally. My parents fell short, and that's bad. I put that label as that's bad on them, or that's wrong. I put myself on the side of right, and in that, I miss all the ways that I'm actually doing the exact same thing. The very act of judgment is non-loving, and it's not acceptance, right? And so by judging them, I'm translating that non-acceptance onto them, and that's not unconditional love. And so I'm not upholding that unconditional love standard for myself by my judgments. And so our judgments can really cloud that equally, right? If you're a parent as well, then that is another call to question, because, could you be missing something where you should be loving your kids unconditionally and you're not? And it's just a question. I'm not saying that anybody should love each other unconditionally. I have no idea. It's just a belief system that I think a lot of people have. But like I said, when we judge, when we put things into categories as good, bad, right, wrong, I'm on the side of right, I'm morally superior to you, you're bad, not only does it evoke more shame, it starts to put people into that shame category, right? Or you use shame tactics. Also, it blinds you from where you are missing something in yourself. So judgment, projections, are another one. Okay. The third one is triggers. So again, this is another one that I didn't really understand forever. And, this is why I feel like I need to kind of break it down a little further. But triggers are kind of where you get, like, you feel this inner tension. It's sort of where you get worked up about someone or something that someone said or a thing that you read. And when you are triggered, it's an indication that there's a war inside of you. Something is not resolved. If you you get worked up, you get bothered, you're frustrated, you feel like you have to tell somebody off, you put yourself into a stressed response, that trigger will point you to what you need to heal in your shadow. So triggers can be personal or impersonal. Like I said, it can be something that you read that's sort of impersonal. Personal would be like if somebody says something about you, like talks about you or says something to you that you find offensive. And it really only holds weight, though, if there's an energetic match within you and something that's still in conflict. So, for example, in my own life, I have been called many names. I'm sure that you could probably relate to. But something that never really triggers me is if somebody calls me the B word or the C word or those sorts of, like, I would say really immature, petty names. I don't identify with that at all. I think that it doesn't spark anything in me. And it's something that I look at as that's just a label. That's just a label that they've put on me, but that's more a reflection of their own projection than it is about me. And because it doesn't work me up, it's no big deal. It's easy for me to write it off. It's easy for me to actually look at them and say, okay, I can understand that you're probably in a state of pain, and I happen to be the punching bag for that. And I can hold space for that, actually. I think that's, I'm not saying that it's okay. I don't condone it, but I can actually hold space for it and say, well, I will sit here with you and I choose to see the person, not the action. And, and then we resolve it from there. But if somebody were to criticize my work, it's something that I do get triggered about actually constantly, because this is probably the most vulnerable thing and courageous thing that I've ever done. Put my thoughts into a podcast or put it into writing and put it out there for the world. I mean, that's really, really intimate. You guys get to know me on a really intimate level. And if somebody says something about my work, that's a huge potential trigger for me, right? Especially if it's criticism. If it's criticism, because there's a lot of times that I still go through a lot of self-doubt and a lot of things that, like, when you embark on a journey where you're starting your own business, it allows you to see everything that you need to heal. It brings things up at, exponential speed. Whereas in my typical life, I would confront wounds that I needed to heal, not all that often, but it challenges you in a way that you've never been, or in a way that I've never been challenged before. But all that to say that if that happens, that's something that I still am not quite sure about. And so if I'm triggered by that, then that's mine for me to heal. I think that it's always helpful that when you're triggered by something, can you see a grain of truth? That points you to your shadow. That points you to where you need to heal, right? Because if you can't see any truth in it and it's still bugging you, it's still coming up, then that's a good indication that you're just overlooking something or you're denying it outright. But if you can see a place where it is a little bit true, or that that's a grain of truth in it, and I'm not saying that it's all true or that it applies to the whole person that you are. I'm just saying that maybe it's something that you do, or something that a thought that you had. When you can see a grain of truth in it, then you can say, okay, well, why did I do that? And then you can confront it and go from there. Okay. The fourth thing that I have is getting defensive, or the inability to stay neutral. So if you jump on the defense, my question to you is, what are you defending? You could say it's the truth, but honestly, the truth doesn't need defending because it stands for itself. Truth always emerges as self-evident, and it doesn't need anybody's defense. And so the only thing that needs defense is the things that you don't want someone else to see. So if you're getting defensive, what is that thing that you don't want to see? That's the question. Also, on the topic kind of related to getting defensive is this inability to consider anything that doesn't fit. I don't want to say your narrative, but doesn't fit into your belief system. Anything that you don't like. If you can't even consider it, or you write things off before you even give it a thought, then that's another indication that you're not even willing to look at it, and you're probably in a state of denial. Your highest self can hold opposing viewpoints simultaneously and see validity in all of them, and then make an ultimate decision on which one he or she wants to align with. That's what your highest self can do. So if you can't see all of those opposing viewpoints and see where they come from and why each one has, merit in its own right, if you can't do that, then chances are that it's because you're not willing to. Your ego has made that decision for you. Your ego has locked you into one line of thinking, and I will link that in the show notes below, but I talk about this ego story that it thinks that it's always right. There's only one line of thinking. There's only one way that it can be. So your ego locks you into that story, and with that, you can't make a conscious decision because there's no decision to be made. Your ego's already made it for you. And I just want to go on a quick little tangent, not to make it too long, but if your ego's making decisions for you, chances are it's rooted in your subconscious programming. So your subconscious programming comes from your childhood. These are things that were handed down to you. You didn't get to write your own script. You were handed a script. And now when you become an adult, it's your responsibility to rewrite your own script, rewrite your own life, say what you want, say what you don't want. But you can't rewrite that script if you don't know you have options. And so if you're in this point of getting defensive, or you can't stay neutral, or you can't see validity to all viewpoints, well, then you don't give yourself any options. You have made that decision subconsciously, or should say your ego made that decision for you, and now you're locked in, right? Your options only open up when you can see multiple viewpoints. Okay. So those are some indicators that you could be in a state of denial. And they're just things to consider. Think of them as not, hard facts, but more questions to ask. When I'm doing this, is it possible that I could be missing something? That's like a really good question to ask. If I get defensive, what could I be missing? When you open it up to possibilities, you're not saying for sure this is what it is. But when you open yourself up to possibilities, it's sort of a gentler way to lead you into the shadow. But the shadow is a really scary place. And so if you feel like you have to come up with that answer hard and fast, and that's it, and you don't give yourself any lead in or soft, gentle grace to walk into that dark forest, then chances are you're just not even going to do it. You got to take one little step at a time. So here are a few other things to consider that could help you make peace with what you're denying. So first off, start with that question. I would say that if I'm doing this, could I be denying something? Just ask yourself that question. Secondly, I would say if you consider that if you always stay in a state of denial, you are cutting your conscious self off from possibilities and from options. This is kind of what I was just talking about, but you were handed a script when you were young. This is who you're going to be. This is what you're going to, do for a job. And it was dictated by your upbringing, by your parents, by the culture you live in. And you can change it. You absolutely can change it to be what you came here to do. That actually is part of your path, but you have to have options in order to change it. If you are only an ego ever, you're probably running your old script. And so it's time for a new one, And so see it as not a crushing, you're not crushing yourself, but you're liberating yourself. You're liberating your highest self from what the ego is protecting or what the ego wants you to be. Okay, the second thing is cut your losses. We tend to go in denial sometimes because we feel like we've already invested. Think about the story that first point, where you feel like you're lying because you've fit your narrative and you can't go back on it now because what would it look like to somebody else, and would you look wishy-washy? And so you just keep perpetuating the story because then, somebody else could see you as valid. It is way better to take a step back, cut your losses, say, I made a decision based on the things that I knew at the time. I now know new information and I made a different decision. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to stop investing in things that don't fuel you, that don't serve you. But if you stay in a state of denial, you never get that option. Your ego will tell you that if you change your mind now, that you've wasted all that time. But the truth is, the only time that you're wasting, or the only resources that you're wasting by upholding the lie, is the ones that you're spending right now. You're wasting more in the future, and you can't change the past. So cut your losses now. Okay, the third thing is, please accept that you are not your shadow. You are not any one thing. You are multifaceted. You have all of these amazing things about yourself. And through your programming and through people who were also hurt and through people who were raised in shame culture, they probably convinced you that you were what you did. You were your mess ups. You were your mistakes. You are not that. You are so much bigger than that. That might be something that you did, and that might be, okay, that was a mistake, or okay, I didn't mean to do that, or I did that and I did it because at that time I was that person and now I'm not that person anymore. But give yourself a little bit of grace. Know that because you do something, or even if you have a deeply held belief about yourself, that doesn't make you you. You're indescribable. You're unlabelable. You are so much more than the bag of skin that you live in, right? And so when you accept that you are not those things on the whole of it, you can see yourself with a little bit more grace, and it makes it a little less harsh to come to terms with the things that you've been pushing down for so long. Okay, lastly, I just have a word on dealing with others who are in a state of denial. And I think I wanted to talk about this because something that always comes up in my mind is, I don't know if you remember this show, but it was so bad. It was like this show where the family members would approach somebody who had an addiction problem, and they would say, we just care about you so much, and they would have an intervention. That's what the show was called. It was intervention, and they would have an intervention and they would read to them how much that person has been hurting them and what their addiction has done. And I think that it was well-meaning, but if you think about publicly displaying somebody's at their worst is the most shameful thing that you could possibly do. And so I wanted to just have a word on dealing with others who are in a state of denial, because denial shows up a lot in addiction, but it also shows up, in many, if somebody's with the wrong person in a relationship, or if they're making wrong career choices, or whatever, that they're in a state of denial, and that there's a better path for them. But we need to understand people. In order for them to face what they've been denying, they need to feel safe, and you need to understand where it's coming from. So here's my word. Know that denial comes from a place of insecurity and feeling unsafe. Your ego tells you that they need to be shown the truth, that they need to, see the light or whatever. And usually that leads us to really aggressive behavior where we have to shove things down somebody else's throat. And if you align with that, not only do you put yourself back in ego, but that's not helpful to them either. In order for somebody to get out of a state of denial, they have to feel like it's safe for their truest self to be exposed. So if you're aggressive, they instinctively will pick up on that and be like, that's not safe. That's not going to lead them to admitting to their mistakes or to coming out of their denial state. The best that you can do is remember a time where you were in a state of denial, or you were in a similar position that they were in, and feel that and ask yourself, what did I need in that moment? How did that show up for you, and how did it feel? And then give them that. And the more you accept yourself, the more you'll automatically be able to to hold space for someone else, the more that you can accept yourself at your best, your worst, your in-betweens, the more you can be present for yourself, the more you will be able to be present for somebody else. And lastly, you cannot force anyone to see what they're not ready to see. And so at the end of the day, yes, you can be there for them. Yes, you can try to pull them out of a hole. Yes, you can try to make them see what they are missing, but ultimately it's always their work, and it's always up to them to figure out what they need and to be able to confront those things only when they're ready. And also, it is totally and always okay to set a boundary. If their denial is negatively impacting you and you've gone through that, you've tried to sit with them, you've tried to help them come to terms with what you think they've been denying, and it still is hurting you. As a sovereign being, you always have the ability to walk away, and sometimes that is what they need. So, with that is all I have for you today. Thank you for dealing with my shoddy, sick voice, and I will see you guys next time. If you enjoyed this episode, I would invite you to subscribe, share it with someone you know, and leave an honest rating or review. You can also connect with me through Instagram at spiritmind.body, through YouTube, or my website. Links to all of these can be found in the show notes below. This work is not easy and requires tremendous self-reflection, grit, and a willingness to be misunderstood, and for that, I honor every single one of you for showing up for your authentic self. Until next time.